only developed the idea of the movable metal type, but he also developed the idea of using a different kind of ink to print from, because he found that the ink that was used for woodblock printing, which is also known as relief printing, that it would slide off of these tiny itty-bitty characters because they were so tiny, so small, that the ink was just too wet as it existed before. So he had to reinvent ink when he was doing this. And ultimately, he used the same process that was used for woodblock printing, except he was no longer carving out the wood block, but the idea of using those raised characters, the part that's raised on these type slugs that are being passed around, putting ink on top of them, and then putting a piece of paper over the top of it, and then pulling the paper off. That's the same process. Relief printing and letterpress printing are the exact same thing. They're all the same kind of printing method. What came about as a result of this is a whole slew of terminology that we still use today that comes out of this method of printing that Gutenberg came up with. For example, the way we refer to typefaces, or to the way that the letters are stored, or what we call composited, came out of the time of Gutenberg's time frame. Remember when we were talking about the Chinese and how they sorted the type way back in their days? How did they do that? How did they do it?
Rhyming?
Yeah, they rhymed the characters. So if they had characters and they sounded like each other, they would put them into the same case. And they had a series of cases that were like big lazy Susans. You know those lazy things that circle around and you can put food on them on the table. Except in this case, it was type slugs that they were putting into those cases. And that was how they sorted them, thousands and thousands and thousands of those characters. Well, the alphabet that we work with, the phonetic sounding way that we compose words, we only have 26 characters that we work with. We can double that because we have characters that we call full uncials, which are the big characters, and then we have the smaller characters that we call half uncials, that are also the same characters, but they're just configured a little bit differently. But that makes 52 characters that have to be sorted out, essentially, plus the numbers, 1 through 0, or 1 through 9 plus 0. In any case, in sorting this out, it was pretty simple to do because once they had all these characters, they could easily put A's into one drawer, B's into another slot, C's into another slot, and so on. And the way that they started to configure them was in these, what they call type cases. The type cases came with an upper portion of it and a lower portion of it. And the upper portion, they put the full uncials, or the uppercase letters. And in the lower portion of the case, they put the half uncials, or the lowercase letters. We no longer call them uncials or half uncials, now we call them upper and lower case, and that term came from what Gutenberg had done. Again, just like looking at this is what a form, what all of those different characters, when they start to put them together, would look like into a composited form. It's not very pretty to look at, but you can see that we have a whole line after line after line of all these characters that are put together. You might also notice that the characters are backwards. When you're passing these little slugs around, you might have noticed that the characters were backwards, and that's because they have to offset onto a sheet of paper. We mentioned that Gutenberg's printing press was nothing more than a wine press that was just with slight modifications to it. But once he had all of these components together, he could start to print in mass quantities. Now, Gutenberg chose as his first object of printing what? What was the first thing that he printed? Liz?
The Bible.
The Bible. Why do we think he printed the Bible?
It's the most popular book of the day, for lack of better words.
It was. It was probably the only book anybody knew about. Why? Why was it the only book that people knew about? Yes, Jessica.
Because it's a religious text and everyone there was Catholic, Protestant, or whatever.
It was before before the Christian church divided off, so they were all Christians. So there was no Protestantism, no Lutheranism, no Catholicism. They were all part of the Christian church at that time. But yeah, the majority of the people that were living at that time were very, very religious. Why were they religious?
They were just coming out of the Dark Ages, I think, at that point. So
Yeah.
that's kind of all they had.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. That they were coming out of the Dark Ages. What are the Dark Ages? Looking for some
Well, all right.
bases.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ann.
Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe descended into like a point of time where there's no real law, or this is your King Arthur legend, you hunt for the Holy Grail and all
Yeah.
that.
So, before, 1,000 years before this, the Roman Empire still had existed. And a lot of people still called what was happening in this time part of the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire that we think of in the movies, Cleopatra and all of that stuff, that was right at around the year 1 of the way that we number our system now. And that was the height of the Roman Empire. That the Roman Empire was huge. It took over almost all of Europe. It was even up in Great Britain, the British Isles. It had moved into parts of Russia. It was down in Africa. It was basically centered around the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, and it was huge. And this is part of the reason that they could do this was because they had such large armies and such large wealth. They had basically conquered everybody that they came in contact with, stole all of their gold, stole all of their information, and used it to their betterment. And for a very long time, for hundreds of years, the Roman Empire was very, very powerful. They had armies all over the place. They built roads, they built waterways, viaducts, and they had connections throughout all of Europe. So all of Europe was communicating back to Rome, back to the Roman Empire itself. And again, it was very, very powerful. However, there was a lot of corruption over the course of, again, many centuries. There was a lot of corruption. There was over push on the part of the Roman Empire, and then there were others that kind of pushed back against them, the Huns and the Visigoths and the Vikings that came in and fought against them and trounced, in many cases, the Roman Empire, the Roman armies that were in those territories. Once those areas were taken over by these barbarians, a lot of those soldiers found that their supply to money and access to the capital was cut off. And it's kind of like what we're looking at today. Without government funding.
We're not that bad, are we?
Without government funding,
I'm trying to think we're not.
People decided to stay home. They decided not to go to their work. They decided not to go to their jobs. They stopped manning the roads. They stopped taking care of the populace in the area around them. And so people kind of congregated inward. As this went on over decades, over centuries, the empire fell apart, and those territories that the Romans had claimed still had people living in them, but now the roads were no longer safe for people to travel on. And if you were trying to get from one city to another city, you were taking your life in your hands by going down those roadways. You would have to hire your whole own army to travel those roadways because there would be robbers out on the roads. And if you were traveling by yourself, you could very much be robbed or killed just from trying to go from one place to another. So people started to cluster inwards. They became smaller and smaller and smaller states, if you will. Smaller little cities and towns with less and less communication between them. The roads fell apart and people started to cluster inward. That's when we started to see castles start to be built up. Because the castles were actually fortresses. They were protectors for the people that were living in that community itself. And so if you go through Europe, you're going to see every few miles another castle pops up. And those were the small villages that had existed in those times that had the people that were staying there for protection. When that happens, when people stop communicating with each other, then we start to develop things like accents or nuances in language. Things start to change. And also, the need to be able to communicate from one town to the next town starts to fall apart. If it's like, okay, the mayor from this city wants to talk to the mayor in this city, how would they do it back in the days of the Romans? They would pass messages back and forth. But now if you're not passing messages anymore, there's no communication going back and forth. And now they've learned how to survive without actually having to have communication from one city to the next city. So language starts to fall apart. And we start to see this communication fall apart and illiteracy start to develop. People don't need to learn how to read and write because there's no need for it in their small little city cluster. Now all they need to know is how to survive. And the majority of the people that were living in these small towns, what they were doing to survive was farming. Farming, running the blacksmith shop, maybe being a tanner, making leather goods, that type of thing. But they didn't really have a need to know how to read and write. But the church recognizes that there's some power in this because the church has the power of a book, the Bible. And they use that Bible to actually let people feel that God is watching them, God is present at all times. So if God is responsible, and if you are illiterate, you can't read the Bible. After a while, after a few generations, somebody that actually holds a book in their hands and can read stuff that nobody else can read, they become very important. They become holy. And they become the messengers of God. And if that messenger of God starts to say things like, that earthquake that hit us? That wasn't nature just doing her little thing, shaking the ground up. No, that was God. And he was smiting you because you're a sinner. And if people hear this, they believe this, they've grown up believing that God is that powerful and don't have anything else to back up or to give them reason why the earth was shaking or why that storm came or why their child died of illness, not knowing about germs or any of that stuff, they believe that God is punishing them. So the church becomes very, very powerful. It becomes very important for the church to try to keep people from learning more stuff. So the Bible was a very important tome for these folks, to the point that when Gutenberg started to create his version of the Bible, he included these kinds of embellishments on the pages of the book. Now, he did this because this was traditional. This was if you held one of those books that the priests that traveled from town to town or were just clustered in your village they had those kinds of embellishments in them. Why do you think they would put those decorations in them if nobody else was really reading these books? Jessica.
Because if anybody else saw it, they would see the artwork on the page.
Okay. Yes, that's part of it. What do you think?
To I guess differentiate his Bible from everyone else.
Okay, I'll buy that. What else?
It's a money thing. For I was reading words like, from what I was reading, it looks like he made special individual ones for really rich people, and that had all the artwork in it, and the rest was sort of like in a black and white print. It was almost like a mark.
You mean as far as Gutenberg goes?
Yeah, no, one of the other guys, not him, but one of the other printmakers down the road.
You're thinking of
Yeah,
Schoeffer.
Yeah, German.
Eventually it came to that, but in the times of Gutenberg, these priests were carrying around books like this that were embellished for a reason. What do you think, Shaden?
Wouldn't they put them on display sometimes for people to see them after they're decorating them?
Yeah, they did that as well.
Another thing, it's just these people weren't that educated, so they used a picture to tell a story. Okay.
Good, yeah, so it was partly that too. So there's a lot of really good reasons. One of the biggest reasons that they decorated these books was because the gold, and they used gold, literally used gold leaf to embellish these books. The gold had a glowing effect. So if you're holding one of these books, if you're a priest, and you're holding this book,
God.
and
Wow.
it's got gold on it, and the light shines on it at a certain angle, it's going to hover back onto you, reflect back onto your face. And what's it going to look like?
God.
Looks like you got a halo.
Exactly.
Looks like you're holy, It's like it fits into that whole idea of, oh my God, this is a messenger of God because they open the book or they hold the book in their hands and the whole thing shines up on their face. Must mean that they're special. Must mean that they're important. And this was not like a lone thing. For thousands of years, people that could read and write were considered special in some way. And they really weren't. They just had an education that other people didn't have. So for Gutenberg, the reason he chose the Bible was the same reason a lot of other people chose the Bible. Other people were wanting to do printing, and other people, when they did their first printings, they chose the Bible as well. Because A, it was the book that most people knew about, and B, because they were trying to take down the church in many ways. The church was very, very corrupt. The church would come, and I'm sorry, I hope that, I'm just saying Christian church in general sense, and at that time. I'm not going to cast any aspersions on how the church looks today, but at that time there was a lot of corruption going on in the church. The church would say to those people that were fearful, that were ignorant, that didn't understand that there were germs and that there were weather and that there was a solar system out there making the eclipses happen and all of that stuff. They didn't recognize those things. And the church would turn to those folks and they would say, God is punishing you. If you do not want God to punish you, you need to give us your money. You need to donate 20% of your income at least every year to the church. And they did this. And so the church was very, very wealthy as a result of this. It made them very rich. And so they had a very vested interest in not seeing the idea of people gaining any kind of knowledge and staying ignorant. Gutenberg knew this. There were other people that knew this. It wasn't very much later than that Martin Luther, published his 92 Theses, disparaging the church and talking about the crimes that were going on in the church, including incestuous behaviors and sexual activities, and again, bribing people to pay away their sins. There was all kinds of stuff that was going on that was really bad in the church at this time. So Gutenberg said, I'm going to make the Bible the first thing that I produce. He also knew that people already had this book memorized. Even though they could not read it, they had heard it told to them time and time and time again through the entirety of their lives. 20, 30 years, you hear something recited to you and you can recite the book back to you. How many of you guys have ever read a book to a small child? Have them sit on your lap, maybe it's green eggs and ham, and you open up the book and you're pointing to the words, or maybe they point to the words as you go along reading it, and they can point out the words as you're reading them. Not that they necessarily recognize those words, some kids do, but they see us doing this and they recognize that those sounds are coming from those characters, and so they start to put it together. That's where reading actually starts, when they start to figure out the characters stand for a sound. Same thing was happening here. These folks had heard the words so many times. They knew in the beginning were the first words. And so they could point to those letters on the first page and recognize that those sounds were coming out of those letters. And as time went on, they could start to figure out, oh, these individual characters are making sounds. And if I can piece those ones together, I can look at any of these words and start to figure out what those words are without having to go through the entire order of the book. So people started to use this as a means of reading. That was what Gutenberg's goal was, for this to be a device for people to read. He also knew that if he could produce these rapidly, he could make a lot of money off of it. So of course there was that part of it too. So Gutenberg had good intentions. He also had, we would call them altruistic intentions, but he also had intentions of making a lot of money off of this. But before he could do that, he had to produce the book. And so now he had all the elements that he needed. He had the movable type, he had ink, he had the printing presses available, he hired people to come work for him, and he started to produce this book. However, to do all of this, it took years and years and years of effort, and he was not independent enough as a jeweler to be able to afford the cost of all of this. So he got a loan. He got a loan from a guy named Johann Fust, who was wealthy and living in the town of Mainz where Gutenberg was from. And Fust gave him a sum of money for the years of this development that Gutenberg had done, and it was going well. Gutenberg was at least halfway, 2/3 of the way through printing this book when Johann Fust started to get greedy. And he looked at what Gutenberg was doing and he thought, I have to share this. I have to share this with Johann Gutenberg. When it's all done, he's gonna get all the credit, and he's gonna take half of the money pay me back my loan, and I just have a partnership in this. What happens if I take it all? And that's what he did. He went to the courts, and it's different courts in those days, not the same as what we have now. And he went to the courts and he said, Johann Gutenberg is overextended on his loan. He owes me money, and I demand money now. I demand that he pay me everything that he has borrowed from me, and I want the proceeds now. And Gutenberg did not have the money because he was in the middle of his project. He knew that once he could finish printing this book and started to sell them, he was going to do well, but there was no book to produce yet. And the way the courts worked in those days, the court sided with Fust and said, okay, you have no money to give him, he takes ownership of all of this stuff that you've developed. And Fust ended up hiring the foreman that Gutenberg had hired and said, finish the job for me, I'll marry my daughter off to you. And he did. And it became his son-in-law. And together, they finished this book, and they started to take it out on the road, and guess what? They made loads of money. To the point that Fust went on to become very, very successful as a printer. Johann Fust and Peter Schoeffer, that was the foreman, they formed their own printing company, and they became very, very successful, producing lots and lots of other documents after that. They even developed the idea of printing in 2 colors instead of just 1 color, as Gutenberg had done, and incredibly successful. And in fact, they developed a lot of different kinds of printing as the years went on. It wasn't just Peter Fust and Peter Schoeffer and Jan Fust that went on to do great things, but we're going to look at a few of those examples here. But I just want to cap off this little exercise about Johann Fust and Peter Schoeffer, at least Johann Fust on his side of it, this greedy man. He did manage to become very, very successful. He had a long, successful life, lots of money that he raised as a result of this, but that almost didn't happen because he was so greedy. The story goes that he was taking this book on the road, going from town to town, and hired his little army to travel with him so he could be protected. And he went from town to town to town, and he was selling these books, and people were buying them because they could be offered at a very reasonable price. In those days, if you didn't have printing, what was the only other means that you could produce a book?
Writing.
Handwriting, yeah. And so the books before this time had been produced in what were called scriptoriums. Again, a Christian church-owned operation. The scriptoriums were filled with monks who spent day in, day out doing nothing but writing the manuscripts of books, specifically the Bible, but they could also be hired to do other books by people that were scholarly and wanted something that was a little bit more than the Bible. But to do that, it was a very tedious exercise. Imagine if you had to write the entire Bible by yourself. How long would it take?
Years.
Years. If you had a room full of scribes that were all doing this, maybe you could produce a handful, maybe 10, 20 of these Bibles in the course of a year with everybody writing at the same time. They were very, very labor intensive, and you multiply that and try to figure out how much it cost. By today's standards, it would be about a year or 2 years worth of income that it would cost to buy a Bible. So imagine that, anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 for one book. Imagine that. That's why people did not have the Bibles. That's why they put these books out on display for people to see, because that's why they embellished them in gold, because they were jewels in themselves. They were considered a treasure to have something that was written. So when Johann Fust went out on the road with these books that people could buy, and they could buy them for a fraction of what it would cost to produce them by hand, that was incredible. People wanted this because, wow, suddenly I have access to the Word of God, and I can pay for it for, instead of $100,000 or $50,000, I can pay $1,000 for it. A bargain, yeah. But for the folks living in those days, that would have been considered really a bargain price for them to buy these things. But Fust wasn't satisfied with that. He was selling lots and lots of these books at that very low, reasonable price. But he went into France. He didn't think highly of the French. He thought, oh, that's French. That's French. People still say that. Mr. French. And he thought, they're not smart at all, so I'm going to fool them. I'm going to tell them that I'm offering these books at a bargain price. And maybe it's not 1,000. Maybe I'll sell them for 5,000. I'm going to tell them that they're hand-lettered. And tell them they're hand-lettered because that's the way that people do it. The French aren't in Mainz, Germany. They don't know that the invention of the printing press has come along because we're living in the Dark Ages. People aren't traveling on the roads. Nobody knows anything. So I'm going to just go in. I'm going to do this. And he went into France and he started to peddle his book, and for the reasonable price of 5 times what he was selling it in other places. And he started to sell the books, and then somebody bought a book, and they started to look at it and went, huh, the letter A right here looks exactly like the letter A here. And the letter A here looks exactly like the letter A here. In fact, every A in this book looks identical to the last one. Now, the type that they were using, backwards, the type that they were using looked like hand lettering. Anybody here ever tried to do hand calligraphy?
Not recently.
Can you make your letters look exactly identical to each other? I dare say you can't, because it's a handcraft. You're doing it by hand. But Fust was trying to say this was all done by hand. And so, what do you think the French thought of that?
It wasn't.
What did they think?
It wasn't.
They recognized it wasn't. What do you think that they started to say?
They wanted to make their own version of it.
Yeah, that's true, they did. But anything else that you can think that they would think about Fust as a result of this? Yes?
Since they didn't know about the printing press, I'm assuming they thought he made a deal with the devil to make a whole bunch of books.
Witchcraft. It's witchcraft. It's magic. It's witchery. And if it's witchcraft, then we have a heathen in our midst. What do we do with heathens?
Burn them to stake. Off the
And,
head. What was it? No, they didn't have the guillotine yet.
Yeah, there wasn't the guillotine yet, but they would hang them, and so, or burn them, or whatever, and so they grabbed Fust and they said, okay, you're a devil. You're working for Satan himself. We're going to string you up. And that's what they were about to do. And Fust said, no, don't do it. It's trickery. It's a machine. It's a machine that did this, and I will give you the rights to this machine. I'll show you how it's done. I'll give you some of my tradesmen, and you can all start to print yourself. And so he gave away some of his printing equipment, and he went ahead and gave some of his tradesmen over to the French in order to save his neck. So there was one way in which printing started to spread from Germany into France. And then shortly after that, there was a war that happened in Germany, and so it hit Mainz, right where all of this printing was happening. And from that point forward, those printers spread out. They took equipment with them. They had the secret recipe that Gutenberg had. So they knew how to smelt those typefaces, and they started to develop their own. And printing spread throughout Europe. And this fostered something that we call the Renaissance. Jessica, did you have a point?
How do we know it was Gutenberg that Faust took all the credit? Did something happen later in life that said, hey, I made this, you just stole it from me, or?
We don't. And that's a very good point, because if you go around to Europe, in various parts of Germany and the Netherlands, you will see from town to town, every once in a while, you'll see a statue erected in the town square that has somebody else's name on it, not Johann Gutenberg's name. And they give that person credit for movable metal type. So we don't know exactly, for sure, who was the real inventor of it. They think it was Johann Gutenberg, but yeah, he didn't actually keep a journal. He didn't actually, and there wasn't actually, any Time magazines following him around and keeping track of what was going on. So it's kind of hearsay. However, the reason why most of us credit it to Gutenberg is because there was enough people that had worked for Gutenberg that pointed back to him to say that he was the inventor, that's why they think that he was the one. And to the point where Time magazine actually named him as the man of the millennium in January 1st, 2000. So they're giving him credit. the news magazine or the Newseum in Washington D.C. gives credit to Gutenberg. I'm going to go along with the crowd, but again, if you go from town to town, you're going to see that other people take credit for this invention also. So there are a lot of people that tried to come up with the same invention at the same time as Cisco.
And what happened to Gutenberg after the court thing?
Yeah, I'll tell you about that in a minute. I want to get to the word Renaissance. Does anybody know what the word Renaissance means? Visiting? Anybody? I heard a whisper. What do you think it means? Actually.
Rebirth.
Rebirth, yeah. So what is the rebirth? Somebody else? Getting the same answers from the same people. How about, no, I can't remember your name.
Courtney.
Courtney, do you have any ideas what rebirth, what they were talking about when they were talking about the rebirth?
Like a new society.
New society. Good, yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts? Yes.
It was like, I think like the church was starting to like not become as popular, and it was more about like arts and music and poetry and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a rebirth of arts and poetry. A rebirth from what? What was being birthed again? Okay, Jessica.
The Roman Empire died, then got rebirthed. Everyone likes the Roman things, Roman statues, Roman paintings.
Yeah, that knowledge that had been left over from the time of the Roman Empire from 1,000 years before was suddenly being rediscovered. And that period led to great innovations. Now we have a document, a book, that can start to tell things. And so once people started to gain literacy, once they started to learn how to read and write, they recognized that they could start to read and write themselves. And they could start to take this information, any information that they had, and put it into books. And they could produce it inexpensively. Once there were more and more and more printers, printing prices dropped so that people could start to afford